Let's talk about how to think about layered complexity for your video games. Nearly every game has a layered complexity because you don't want a newbie to face the full brunt of the complexity of your game. It'll drive them away. So you start simple, and then add in complexity. Or your game might have complexity that's based on game state. So you start simple, and then as the game state evolves, complexity arrives. Either way, you start simple. This is something that should be intentional. The way the game gains complexity is something that will radically change how your player feels about your game. It is a major pacing mechanic. But a lot of devs just do it instinctually, and I don't approve of that. I think this is something you should have a tight grip on. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how to think about complexity and layering it into your game. We're going to start by comparing layered complexity to tutorials. What's the difference? I mean, both of them are about bringing the player up to speed, right? You want the player to play at the highest complexity level. So what's the difference between the two? Well, the difference is that a layered complexity game is a fun game at every level of complexity. It is a game throughout. Whereas a tutorial is just there to get you to the game. It's not a game itself. So, a tutorial might have a play graph that looks kind of like this, right? And then this is where you want the player to be. Whereas a layered complexity game might be like this. And there's where you want the player to be. But each of these is a fun game on its own. And of course, because these are adaptable, they're responsive, every player might have a slightly different set of, how they go through the game. Another player might be like this. Or a really experienced player might be like this. How they get through the early tiers, the early layers, is up to them. Moreover, because each of these layers is a complete game on its own, a fun game on its own, you can constantly call back to those previous layers. They're not things that you really leave behind. I think maybe it would be easiest to give you an example. City building games. Modern city building games involve zoning and roads, but when you start your little town usually starts without very many concerns. You don't need to worry about cops or disasters or plumbing or whatever. But as your city grows, they add in concerns about crime and concerns about fire and tax policy and all sorts of other junk like that. With the idea being that the larger your city is, the more layers of complexity you have in managing it. This is one of the things that makes these games feel the way they feel. I don't particularly think that these kinds of layers are very good because they are fiat layers, right? There's no reason why you suddenly need cops at a specific size city. There's no reason why at a specific size city suddenly disease happens. It's just something the devs put in at the proper moment when they felt it would be a useful tool in changing the way the player is playing. It's a pacing technique. Let me give you an alternate example. Let's say you're playing Kerbal and you're launching your little rockets. Pew! And you get the hang of launching little rockets, so you build a bigger rocket. Well, Kerbal rockets are beholden to some version of physics, so when you launch that bigger rocket with all of its various outrigger bits, it explodes violently, and you have a very hard time launching it, so you keep trying, you keep rebuilding it and changing things until you get it to launch. The larger rocket is much harder to launch because of the fundamental nature of physics. So this is the same situation. As you get bigger, there are more constraints, more concerns. But in this case, it's not some set of fiat constraints. It's some kind of algorithm that is easy to understand and easy to intuit. Now, in both of these cases, the City Builder and Kerbal, it's not that the game is leading up to the biggest rockets or the biggest cities. The game is fun when you're firing off small rockets or creating small towns. Those are games that are complete. You can play those games for a long time. With Kerbal, I still do small rocket launches because it's fun to see how far you can stretch them. So what we're getting at here is that there are a lot of ways to introduce complexity, but none of these ways require you to have a game that is not fun at lower complexity levels. You want to make sure that whether you're doing it by fiat or by algorithm, you're going to want to have a game that is fun, even when you're playing it at what you might consider an entry level. Another example of something like that would be base building games. Modern base building games start you off with a small set of modules or rooms, things that you start with when you're building your bases. And then as you go through, they'll let you upgrade your bases in a variety of ways so that you can unlock more levels of complexity. So, for example, a lot of them will have a tech tree where you can unlock new tech by researching the more advanced elements. Most of them will also have some kind of layer on top of the base building. For example, fighting or nobles. So let's say that you're playing Cultivation Simulator. Let's say you're playing Amazing Cultivation Simulator. So there's a base building layer, and you're trying to master it. Maybe you move through it quick, maybe you move through it slow, maybe you have multiple layers flying at once because you're super cool. Either way, at some point, you add in the martial artists, which are kind of the point of the game. And this is a standard base building approach. It's the same as the other games. You have your psychic kings in RimWorld, you've got your nobles in Dwarf Fortress. Everybody at some point allows you to add in useless creeps. And the useless creeps don't help your base building at all. They just siphon resources away. So the idea is that how well you build your base determines how many useless creeps you can put on top. But there's no direct correlation, besides some very minor stuff like requiring specific kinds of rooms. This layer is what drives the long game. So in Amazing Cultivation Simulator, Kung Fu Masters are the only people who can actually go out into the world. They're the only people who can have adventures and recruit people and all that jazz. So in addition to being good in a fight, they unlock the entirety of the long game. But I think that this is kind of rough. I think this is just a stage that we're in, because this doesn't really relate back down into base building in any significant way. With the examples I gave you earlier, as the rocket gets larger and more complicated and harder to shoot up into the sky, that will radically affect how you build your rocket. So in these situations where the base building just kind of becomes a supporting element rather than the focus, it's like, is it really a base building game at that point? It's a game with base building, but it's not really about the base building, is it? And that's true. In Amazing Cultivation Simulator, it's about building your cultivators. It's about building your martial artists. The base is just something that happens. And you can say that's okay, but I say that I would like it if the base building was more deeply entangled with these upper layers, in the same way that something like physics is entangled with rocket launches, or more layers of things like, police and crime and fire and sewers and stuff like that was related to your city. I want them to remain entangled so that it's a whole game the whole way through, rather than something you kind of leave behind and just do maintenance on. Let's do one more example. Role-playing games. So there are two kinds of role-playing games on the computer. One kind of role-playing game is based on Pathfinder or D&D, and that is the kind of role-playing game where you make a character, and there are a few choices to make up front. And there's 80 or 90 different classes and 19 different stats with 18 different kinds of bonuses attached to them, and then you get to choose 46 different techniques from a list of 9,864 techniques. There's a tremendous amount of complexity right up front in these games, because that's the way the tabletop game works. We're not going to get into why, but that's how the tabletop game works. And so that because they have the license to the tabletop game, they just make the computer game work the same way. This doesn't really work out. It is a tremendous amount of complexity for very little payoff. There is realistically very little difference in terms of whether you take class 46B or 46C. They're pretty much the same until the end game. So front-loading it like that is not helping anybody. But they have a license. On the other hand, if we consider a game that is, a little bit more reserved, something like, say, Final Fantasy, where you start at a fairly simple level, putting aside certain Final Fantasies, you start at a fairly simple level, and as the game goes on, you get more and more complexity. But do you really? No, you don't. You get more powers. Your numbers go up. But the number of times you actually unlock another layer of complexity, fairly low. Like, if your numbers keep going up, that doesn't change the complexity of the game. Watch, this is you. Your numbers are going up. Ooh, look at all those numbers going up there. The complexity is not going up. And if anything, it's going down because you can now mow down monsters faster. And then all of a sudden you get summoning, or dual wielding, or magic enchanting, or something like that, and suddenly your options explode. This is the new layer. If we were to go back to something like D&D, if you're playing Magus McMage Hat, here, I'm a Magus McMage Hat, or whatever, right? And you're wandering around at low levels, you're mostly going to be firing off basic spells like Grease and Magic Missile. And because D&D is very, very iffy, you're going to be firing Magic Missile until you're 96. So as you progress, at some point you unlock more advanced spells, and suddenly your complexity starts to explode. Suddenly you can cast Fireball and Lightning Bolt, which are massive area effect attacks, and you've never had to worry about that before, except for with Burning Hands. So the point here is that there are moments when you gain complexity, but there are also moments when you just get more powerful, and those are not the same thing. This is something that you, as a designer, should be choosing when to unlock. How much complexity do you want to add? When? You might think, oh, well, we should just always add complexity, but then your game is going to really bog down. The more complexity you add in, the slower everything gets, because the player has to stop and consider what's coming up next. Can I handle this? Can I tweak that? So the more complexity you add into your game, the slower the pace becomes. Now, at some point, the player is going to get a handle on the things that they once considered quite difficult. They're going to kind of reduce that complexity down to a couple of basic heuristics. And then maybe you can introduce more complexity to keep them going at the right level of slowness. Or maybe you actually reduce the amount of complexity for this next bit so that they feel that quick bit, rather than the slowness. These are considerations that I don't feel people discuss as much as they should. Understanding that your game is built out of systems, you can then figure out which systems you want to turn on how much, when. And you can allow the player to work through that. I've given you some examples, but there are literally an unlimited number of examples. Every game does this. We could talk about, like, say, a first-person shooter game where you unlock rocket launchers, or Deus Ex, where you decide that you're going to actually get a sniper rifle and suddenly you can snipe. These options allow you to do so much more than you could before. They add in a lot more considerations. They may not actually make you do more work. There might not be more steps as you're moving through the game, but there are more considerations. Like, oh, can I snipe here? That's not a question I would have asked last chapter because I didn't have a sniping rifle. These are intentional. These are things that you can do on purpose, specifically to make the player feel a specific way at a specific time over the course of your game. And I hope that this was useful. Let me know.